welcome to the TEDx Johannesburg stage. Thanks for making time to share some insights with us today.
Thanks very much for having me.
Okay, so you are a journalist. Can you tell us a bit about how you end up here?
So I started off as a student studying something very different from journalism. I studied speech therapy and audiology. And while I knew very well from the first year of that course, it was 4 years long, that I didn't want to become a speech therapist, I did want to finish the course. And so I had 4 years to figure out what I wanted to do. And at the university where I studied, you could only study journalism postgraduately. So you had to have a degree in something, and then you would do a year of journalism afterwards. So during those 4 years, I could get to the decision that I wanted to be a journalist. And why a journalist? Because it was hard for me I had many interests, and it was hard for me to pin it down. And journalism was the profession that required me to make the least amount of choices, because you could report on anything in journalism, so you could cover all the fields. And I was very interested in both broadcast and print, and journalism also allowed you to do both of that.
So why health?
So my first job was in the Eastern Cape in Port Elizabeth at the SABC in the radio newsroom. And when you're a junior reporter and you walk into a newsroom, you're certainly not going to be assigned the political stories. Those are for the senior journalists in the room. So health was something I could get into because the senior journalists had been there for a while, and the Eastern Cape health system had been not functioning so well for quite a number of years. So they were tired of those stories, which was an opportunity for me to get into them. And I grew up in Cape Town and had very little exposure to rural areas in the Eastern Cape, and really found it fascinating to travel to those areas, and learned very quickly that health is like a mirror of society. It shows you exactly what society looks like, and it allows you to report on anything. It is the beat that I find that literally allows you to report from gender issues to politics to medical stuff to just how people live.
That's interesting, because this is like 25 years ago, and you mentioned the Eastern Cape, and ironically, today we're talking about COVID, and the Eastern Cape keeps popping up in the news as the province that is struggling with the health system. So obviously you've reported on other epidemics, pandemics, HIV, TB, malaria. So what is different for you with COVID, if anything?
No, there's certainly differences. I think the biggest other epidemic that I've reported on is HIV. And I was a very young reporter when Thabo Mbeki was president and there was HIV denialism. And during those times, if you were a health reporter, you were an AIDS reporter. That's all you did for 3 or 4 years. You just reported on AIDS, and it was a political beat because it had all to do with politics, about a president not acknowledging that HIV causes AIDS, and there wasn't treatment in the country, and the health minister at the time. So two big differences between COVID and AIDS is that the one is a very fast moving epidemic, the other one is slow. COVID moves much faster than HIV, and that means that research comes out at the speed of light and often comes out without being peer reviewed, and it means that what you report on is often not always correct. It's very hard to figure out if that science is correct because it's so fast-tracked. With HIV, that was a bit different. You had more time to figure that out. But in South Africa specifically, one of the biggest differences in reporting on HIV and COVID is the government's response. In the case of COVID, the government has an evidence-based response. Yes, there are many differences in how scientists interpret the science, and they have very healthy and very public arguments about what is the best strategy. But ultimately, it's all based on evidence. No one is saying there isn't COVID, or no one is saying, the coronavirus isn't causing COVID. Where during the HIV time, it was very different. It was a political beat. In the first years, because there was a government that didn't provide evidence-based treatment because some political leaders didn't believe in it. And that meant that the kind of reporting that you did was very different. It was very much on what the president said and what the health minister said, as opposed to what's the latest scientific treatment that came out, because it wasn't available in the country, but also it was it was not the focus of reporting. I guess you can compare it a little bit with the United States, with Donald Trump.
Their
COVID, yeah.
Their COVID moment is what was our HIV moment. It actually kind of sounds similar.
Absolutely. And if you look at the US media's reporting on COVID, if someone had to go and count how many reports there are on what Donald Trump said today again, there will be quite a significant part of that reporting, which is what the president said. And in the end, that's not so meaningful because it's a lot of he said, she said, as opposed to how should we interpret the data to get better treatment? And so I think that's the political side of it when it comes to HIV and COVID are two very different things in South Africa. It doesn't mean that the government is not criticized now. Look at all the corruption, right? I mean, there's a lot of accountability that we need to report on. But the kind of scientific arguments we see in the media and among scientists and the government are of a very different nature than at the beginning stages of HIV.
Is it also, I mean, I've learned quite a lot. Before COVID, I kind of had a sense of how research works, the peer-reviewed research papers, the preprints. Is it also that the internet might have contributed to science literacy? Is it, or is it just how open and transparent the government and the science community is?
I think something that COVID undeniably did is that it brought science into our homes. No one even knew what an epidemiologist was, an average person before this. I remember the chair of our Ministerial Advisory Committee, Salim Abdul Karim, telling a story recently in a webinar saying people thought, he was a dermatologist, a skin specialist, because epidemiologist sounds a little bit like that. And it is now amazing how everyone knows what an epidemiologist does, that he doesn't have to explain what he's doing. And I think, also words like positivity rate, of what's the positivity rate of how many tests that we've done are positive, what proportion, those are things that no one had a clue of previously. So I think also because research is published so quickly and fast-tracked at the moment, and everyone depends on that research for what happens to them tomorrow. Is there treatment? How will I get infected? There's a much greater interest in it, and the media obviously reports on it more. One very big difference in the media with COVID is that overnight, everyone became a health reporter. Whether you were a political or a business journalist didn't matter. All of a sudden, you had to report on science. It doesn't mean that you were necessarily equipped to do that, but you had to do it. And if the entire media only reports on science for 6 months, surely the public is going to be more exposed to it.
So, Mia, thank you so much for this time. Your final thoughts on the new normal coexisting with COVID?
So I think the thing to remember is that, yes, COVID vaccines are becoming available, but there's not going to be enough for everyone for a very long time. So that means our lives are not going to change back to normal, within a year. South Africa is, for instance, only planning to acquire enough vaccines for 5% of our population for next year. So masks are certainly here to stay. I think other diseases like TB can also benefit from them. Hand sanitizers are here to stay. When you look at something like budgets of organizations for offices, at Bekisisa, we've returned to the office, but we only go twice a week because COVID taught me that people can be more productive when they work from home. And I doubt that very large offices will continue to exist. I think people will still go to offices because you do need that interaction, and that is very beneficial to how you operate. But I think there will be more flexibility, and perhaps budgets may be spent, more towards other things, and the actual the space might become a bit smaller. And I think we're likely for the next couple of years to socialize differently. I don't think I would want to go to a nightclub.
Definitely not. But yeah, thank you. And all the best with the rest of the year and the next years to come. And hope to see you at some point on a red circle with humans in the room.
Thank you very much.
All right.